What if everything you've been told about the Civil War is only half the story? Most people think it boiled down to one word: slavery. And while that's true, the full picture runs much deeper, into money, politics, fear, and the very meaning of freedom in America. This wasn't just a clash between North and South. It was a nation tearing itself apart, with both sides convinced their survival was on the line. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on the real causes of the American Civil War. Some you know, some history tried to bury. Slavery as the core. Slavery wasn't just part of the South's identity. It was the identity. By the 1850s, nearly 4 million enslaved people lived in the South, fueling the cotton, tobacco, and sugar industries. The cotton gin had turned slavery into the engine of the Southern economy, pushing it westward and making it more profitable than ever. But this wasn't only about labor. Slavery meant wealth, it meant power, and it meant status. Southern elites built their fortunes and their social standing on the backs of enslaved people. Even poor white farmers who owned no slaves supported the system because it gave them someone to look down on and a dream to aspire to. The North was moving toward factories and wage labor, but for the South, slavery was not negotiable. It wasn't tolerated, it was entrenched. And that deep entrenchment would soon clash with a rising tide of resistance from the North. States' rights or slaveholders' rights? You've probably heard people say the Civil War was about states' rights. But here's the truth. The right they were fighting for was the right to own human beings. Southern leaders framed it as protecting their independence. But when you look closer, it's clear that slavery was the core of those so-called rights. The Fugitive Slave Act made this crystal clear. It forced northern states to return runaway slaves to the South, even if slavery was outlawed locally. When many in the North refused to comply, the South saw it not just as defiance, but as betrayal, a direct attack on their survival. To Southern elites, any restriction on slavery was an attack on their power and way of life. States' rights became a slogan, but underneath it was always about protecting slavery. And while the South dug in, the North was changing in ways that only deepened the divide. The economic divide. By the mid-1800s, the North and South were living in two different worlds. The North was booming with factories, railroads, banks, and bustling cities. Immigrants poured in, providing cheap labor, fueling industry, and driving literacy rates higher than ever. It was a region built on progress and rapid change. The South, on the other hand, clung tightly to its plantation economy. Cotton, tobacco, and rice dominated everything, and slavery wasn't just useful, it was the backbone of the system. Modernization was seen as dangerous because anything that threatened slavery threatened their entire way of life. Then came tariffs. Federal policies designed to protect northern industries cut deeply into Southern profits. To planters, it felt like the Union was rigged against them, that Washington was serving northern interests while draining the South dry. Economically, culturally, and politically, the North and South were drifting apart. And the bigger the gap grew, the harder it became to find common ground. Political chaos of the 1850s. If the economy drove the wedge deeper, politics lit the fuse. The 1850s were nothing short of chaos. Every time America added new land, the same question exploded. Would it be free or would it allow slavery? The Missouri Compromise and later the Compromise of 1850 tried to keep the peace, but they were shaky bandages on a bleeding wound. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, giving new states the power to decide for themselves. What followed wasn't democracy. It was bloodshed. Bleeding Kansas turned into a mini-civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, shocking the nation and foreshadowing the nightmare to come. Meanwhile, a brand new political force rose, the Republican Party, founded in 1854 with one mission: to stop the spread of slavery. To the South, that wasn't just politics. It was war by another name. The idea that their way of life could be boxed in terrified them, and that fear only escalated when one man entered the White House: Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's election and secession. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, the South didn't wait to see what he would do. They panicked. To them, Lincoln represented the death of slavery, even though he never called for its immediate abolition. What terrified Southern leaders was his firm opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories. If slavery couldn't spread, they feared it would eventually collapse. Before Lincoln even stepped foot in the White House, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union, and they didn't hide their reasons. Their official declarations spelled it out with stunning clarity. Slavery. Mississippi declared, "Our position is thoroughly be identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Forget the myth that secession was about abstract rights. These states were explicit. They weren't fighting for independence in general. They were fighting for the survival of slavery. And the stage was now set for the first shots of a war that would rip the country apart. The spark, Fort Sumter. The tension finally exploded on April 12, 1861. In Charleston Harbor, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union stronghold. Cannon smoke filled the sky, and the first shots of the Civil War echoed across America. But Fort Sumter wasn't just an isolated clash. It was the breaking point after decades of political fights, failed compromises, and deep mistrust. Every uneasy truce, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, even the Kansas-Nebraska Act, had only delayed the inevitable. By 1861, compromise was dead, and both sides knew it. The South had gambled everything on secession. The North, under Lincoln, now faced a choice: accept disunion or fight to preserve the Union. And with those cannon blasts in Charleston Harbor, the United States crossed a line it could never step back from: the Dred Scott decision and cultural tensions. Even before the war, the fight over slavery was ripping America's identity apart. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered one of the most explosive rulings in U.S. history, the Dred Scott decision. The court declared that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could never be citizens. Even worse, it ruled that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in U.S. territories. For the South, this was a green light. For the North, it was a nightmare. Moderates who had once tried to compromise now felt the system was rigged, that the South held too much control over the nation's future. But it wasn't just politics or courts fueling the fire. It was culture. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin gave Northerners a vivid look at the brutality of slavery. It outraged Southerners who saw it as a direct attack on their way of life. Abraham Lincoln would later call Stowe the little lady who started this great war. The divide cut so deep that Americans no longer agreed on what liberty even meant. To the South, liberty meant freedom from government interference. To the North, liberty meant freedom from slavery itself. Two visions of America, impossible to reconcile. The myth of the lost cause. When the smoke cleared and the South lay defeated, a new battle began, the battle over memory. Southern leaders and writers crafted what became known as the lost cause narrative. They painted the Confederacy as a noble fight for independence, a tragic struggle for honor and states' rights. But the documents tell a very different story. The declarations of secession from Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas didn't mince words. They explicitly named slavery as the reason they left the Union. These weren't vague statements. They were detailed, unapologetic, and crystal clear. The Confederacy was built to defend slavery. The lost cause twisted history, turning Confederate generals into romantic heroes and burying the central role of slavery. It became a way for the South to preserve pride while denying the brutal truth. And for decades, that myth reshaped how millions of Americans understood the war. But when we strip away the myth and face the evidence, the reality is undeniable. The Civil War wasn't about abstract freedom. It was about the fight to preserve or to destroy human bondage. Conclusion: the American Civil War was never just about politics, tariffs, or vague notions of states' rights. At its core, it was about slavery, the institution that shaped the South's economy, culture, and identity, and the issue that the North and South could no longer compromise on. Decades of tension, fueled by economic divides, political chaos, Supreme Court rulings, and cultural clashes, all came to a breaking point in 1861. When the South seceded, they made their motives clear, preserving slavery above all else. And when the cannons roared at Fort Sumter, there was no turning back. The war that followed would cost more American lives than any other conflict in U.S. history. But it also forced the nation to confront its greatest contradiction, the idea of liberty in a land built on bondage. So the next time someone says the Civil War was about states' rights, ask the only question that really matters: the right to do what? Thanks for watching. The story of the Civil War isn't just history. It's a reminder of how fragile a nation can be when it's divided. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's untold truths. And I want to hear from you. What do you think was the biggest cause of the Civil War? Was it economics, politics, or was slavery always the core? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because the discussion does doesn't end here. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the stories history tells us.